Exchanging the latest news has been part of human culture for thousands of years. Communicating news in oral cultures is dependent on individuals personally conveying information to others. Information in oral cultures can come from eyewitnesses, hearsay, or internal experiences such as visions, dreams, or hallucinations. News communicated orally is affected by the social conditions of the present as well as the commonly held views of the past. Oral societies shared information by using strategies that help make the information more memorable. The news must be of interest to the audience, and the more sensational the news is, the more likely it is to be repeated. Strategies such as using mnemonic patterns, exaggeration, repetition, standard themes, and emphasis help to make ideas more memorable, and as a result, easier to recall and retell. Sharing news in oral societies depended on relationships and interactions between individuals. In times of war, for example, messengers had to communicate information personally from the battlefield to those that needed it. One of history's most famous legends that highlights the challenges of exchanging news in oral societies took place during the ancient Greek Battle of Marathon. The legend describes a group of Athenian soldiers watching as almost 3 times as many Persian warriors landed on their shores, prepared to conquer. Exchanging the latest news fell to people like Phidippides, a messenger who specialized in running long distances over difficult terrain to share information. The legend claims that Phidippides ran 36 hours straight from Marathon to Athens to personally share news of the great victory that had taken place, before dying from exhaustion. Though exchanging news in oral societies was not always so difficult, it relied exclusively on the efforts of individuals to continually pass information from one person to the next. As written language began to creep into ancient Greek culture, sharing of the latest news began to evolve as well, though not without a prolonged period of transition. Even great thinkers like Plato expressed concerns that the skills needed to remember important events, to think critically, and to share the latest news would be lost as writing came into greater use. As culture shifted from oral to literate, so too did the means for exchanging the latest news. By the 1st century BCE, literacy levels in ancient Rome were on the rise. Written records of government proceedings can be traced back to ancient Rome. Julius Caesar introduced a radically new practice by publishing the daily business of the Senate after being elected Roman consul in 59 BCE. These acta diurna, or daily events, were inscribed in metal or stone and were placed in prominent public areas such as the Roman Forum where they could be read. The intention behind this publication, however, was not necessarily to provide information to the general public, as much as it was a savvy political move against the Senate, whose proceedings had been previously kept secret from the public. Compared with news spread orally, the permanence of these written accounts would have been more effective at holding the Senate publicly accountable. Newsletters that contained information from the Acta Diurna were also copied out by slaves and sent throughout the empire. This unprecedented level of news dissemination would not be outdone for 1,000 years. Certain kinds of information that could be found in newspapers today were also transmitted through Roman graffiti. Public announcements such as upcoming events, individuals campaigning for public office, even public execution notices were painted on walls using large lettering in black or red paint. Some of the most well-known examples are those that were found on excavated walls at Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried after the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, and included what appeared to be early classified ads promoting local businesses and services that were available at the time. Both of these examples speak to the growing sway that writing held in ancient Roman culture for the transmission of information. The shift towards a greater role for writing was clearly taking hold, as more government transactions, as well as contracts between individuals, included some form of written documentation. The administration of the empire itself, which by 79 CE extended to Great Britain in the north and North Africa in the south, was dependent on writing to maintain accurate records and a continuous flow of administrative information. As literacy spread through Europe in the 15th century, literate individuals began to take interest in the affairs of other cities. Trade, politics, and warfare were of interest to those with business or political connections to other regions. Though Gutenberg had begun to produce printed Bibles by this time, handwritten newsletters began to make a comeback for the first time since the days of the Roman Empire. Handwritten manuscripts with the latest political news were also produced in areas in which printing services were still unavailable. By no means did Europe hold a monopoly on developments in written news. China also began creating handwritten records about government-related news during the Tang dynasty called Tipao. By about 600 CE, TPOW were being copied onto rudimentary paper from wooden blocks covered in ink. Perry, 2011, suggests that in fact these were the first printed news medium. These publications would continue in some form for about a dozen centuries. Johann Gutenberg revolutionized printing with his use of movable type in the mid-15th century. As with other forms of written expression, movable type and the printing press allowed printers to produce and distribute written works in quantities that were not previously feasible. This resulted in a significant drop in unit costs, allowing those outside elite social circles the chance to acquire printed texts. 50 years after movable type revolutionized the printing process in Europe, printed news pamphlets and broadsides were produced occasionally when people had announcements or news they wanted published or distributed. These printed pamphlets had the distinct advantage of reproducing information in exactly the same way with each copy. Information could be distributed quickly to a large and scattered public. One of the earliest pamphlets Gutenberg printed was timely and political in nature, calling on European rulers to retake Constantinople, which had been taken by the Ottomans in May of 1453. Pamphlets were followed by news books, which were made up of several pages that normally described a single event and could contain woodcut illustrations. Usually these were events that someone in power wanted to be made public, such as a wedding or victory on the battlefield. At this point, ruling elites still maintained tight control over publications. Individuals who wished to publish dissenting political views often did so anonymously to avoid any retribution from governing classes that disagreed with their points of view. Handwritten manuscripts were expensive and therefore available only to those that could afford them. Printed materials became cheaper by comparison and could be printed for much larger reading audiences. Though it took decades for the audience to grow, printing was eventually responsible for massive growth in levels of public literacy. This was undoubtedly supported by the expansion of printing in commonly used languages other than Latin. This was a significant blow to the institutional authorities of the time, allowing an even greater number of individuals the chance to engage in discourse about an expanding range of topics. Drastic improvements in literacy levels, however, did not develop immediately after Gutenberg's invention. In spite of this fact, during the first 50 years after Gutenberg began printing books, 10 million copies of books had been printed in Europe using his system. This astonishing feat is even more amazing considering the limited number of individuals who could read in Europe at the time. Many individuals were still illiterate and preferred to get their news from village gossip, the traveling entertainer, or the town crier. As printing expanded over the course of several decades, so did literacy levels. As literacy levels grew, printing grew along with it. This trend continued until 150 to 200 million books had been printed by the end of the 16th century. By the beginning of the 16th century, newspapers had not yet established the format that we are familiar with today. Early printed pamphlets were popular with those who were educated, but were often one-time publications that were not printed on a regular basis. Almanacs eventually provided a format that would be used by newspapers in the future. These hugely popular documents involved a group of calendars, as well as astrological and star charts, that would be used for agriculture and for household reference. These publications were eventually overshadowed and pushed aside as newspapers became more relevant and readily accessible to the public.
In its early years, printing existed mostly as a way to reproduce the written material that already existed. New forms of text took years to evolve. Manuscripts and Bibles were among the first documents to be converted to print, but they remained the complex and difficult to read texts they had always been. Before the year 1500, pamphlets and flyers were the most common form of materials produced. These materials dealt mainly with political or military affairs. They were irregularly produced and had a relatively small readership. The concept of literature was evolving following the invention of the printing press, but at a very slow pace. It was not until 1588 that the first periodicals were published in print, and even they were only released twice a year. The postal service and political systems were perhaps the biggest factors for the creation of and rapid interest in the newspaper. Gutenberg's printing press allowed for rapid reproduction of text in an accurate and reliable form. But this would have had little impact for something as immediate as a newspaper if there did not exist proper infrastructure for the transfer and dissemination of the information that would fill its pages. The postal service was improving in the 1490s. It was becoming a broader, farther-reaching system with increasing capacity to move information. Improved connections between couriers allowed information to be received across large distances quicker than ever before. The postal service was used for both political and personal information. Political advice was the name of the handwritten documents sent between elites and politicians to discuss the political issues of the day. These documents were routinely separated from personal mail through the sorting process of the postal service. These political advice letters were compiled by the postmaster to create handwritten news sheets. News sheets were handwritten documents which combined a number of political advice sheets on one piece of paper. These news sheets were then reproduced weekly and disseminated to subscribers through the postal service, providing the first weekly handwritten newspapers. These news sheets remained an interest reserved for the elite and privileged for a number of reasons. It was often the elite who could afford the handwritten sheets, and literacy was generally a privilege of the upper classes. The political and military content of such news sheets also tended to be of little interest to the general public, whose knowledge of the political system was limited. For the printed newspaper, Europeans would still have to wait another 100 years. It was not until the 17th century that one innovative man combined the political information provided from the postal service with the technology of the printing press. Johann Carolus, a humble printer inscribed for the periodical newspaper in Strasbourg, Germany, made most of his earnings reproducing written text. In the autumn of 1605, business was slow for Carolus, and in an attempt to earn some extra money, he wrote to the government of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, asking for permission to print handwritten newspapers on his printing press. Never before had the printing press and news sheet industry been combined. The result was a life-altering process for people across the globe. Carolus printed the news word for word as he received it. Editing was not a part of his process, and this dry, factual writing became a characteristic of early newspapers. Printed newspapers were simply a more efficient way to produce handwritten news sheets. Early newspaper creation remained a process that could be completed by a postmaster and printer. Editing and journalism remained undiscovered professions until the 17th century. The newspaper quickly caught on in cities across Germany, and soon after expanded throughout Europe. The printed newspaper made its way to Holland in 1618, England in 1622, France in 1631, Spain in 1641, and finally arrived in Russia in 1702. By the end of the 17th century, newspapers were being printed in every major city across Europe. Most of the papers in the 17th century were delivered irregularly until July 1st, 1650, when the first daily newspaper was printed in Leipzig, Germany, with a printing schedule of 6 days a week. The rulers of the European countries in which newspapers were appearing were involved in newspaper production from the outset. Each major government sponsored a newspaper and provided printers with information the government wanted printed, such as new laws and regulations. In most countries, printers were also required to obtain a license or privilege to create a periodical. Printers often had to pay a fee to the government, and in return were provided with a monopoly on printing in a certain area. Printers were also subject to censorship from the government. Those in charge usually withheld controversial news or topics that might cause unrest among the citizens. The rulers, however, were not the only reason newspapers tended to remain neutral. It was more profitable for a printer to remain neutral so that they remained desirable to a wide variety of people. In England, a law banning the importation of English-language printed materials prevented early adoption of newspapers. It was not until 1621 that the government allowed one printer the rights to print news books in England. Even with the establishment of this printer, the English government forbade the production of English news, allowing only foreign news in its news books. Despite this law, many printers in England attempted to start newspapers in the mid-1600s, but they were often shut down by the government. As a result, pamphlets and pamphleteering became very popular in the country. In 1665, the popular newspaper The London Gazette was published as the Oxford Gazette. Finally, 4 years later, in 1669, due to a lack of funds and resources to combat the volume of emerging newspapers, the English government allowed the Licensing Act to lapse, making England the only country where newspapers could be established without government permission. This lack of censorship led English papers to become politically polarized. The impact of these newspapers, however, was less dramatic than one might think. The English government imposed a stamp tax on printing paper which kept newspaper prices high, thereby preventing a number of lower-class citizens from purchasing newspapers. In other countries, it was more difficult to portray opinion through the newspaper. One way of getting around this was to send content to the Netherlands for printing and have it returned for distribution in the country. This was particularly important for English and French newspapers in the 1600s, although it became less important for England after 1669. The most influential papers in Europe were of French origin. Since it was so difficult for rulers to prevent the newspapers printed in the Netherlands from spreading, they often provided editors with confidential information and negotiated postal rates to remain in control. Throughout Europe, it was increasingly difficult for governments to remain in control of the newspaper industry. The number of newspapers was exploding. In Germany alone, 93 newspapers were being published by the year 1750. The French Revolution of 1789 provided a hotbed for the distribution and consumption of political information. Before the Revolution, Paris had only 4 newspapers, but by the time the French Revolution was over that same year, 140 new newspapers had been published in Paris. To fulfill the public desire for information, newspapers were being established in large numbers. At the same time, there remained a large population of illiterate citizens that were interested in the information in the newspapers but unable to read them. This resulted in the establishment of coffee houses, cafes, and reading rooms across Europe, where the contents of the newspaper could be discussed, debated, and public opinion could be formed. Unlike ever before, information was available to the masses with little social or economic divisions. By the end of the French Revolution, newspapers were well established in Europe, and despite the attempts of those in power, there was no way of controlling the contents of the newspaper. Some newspapers had press runs of up to 20,000 copies, and there were newspapers aimed at specific parts of the population. The French Revolution created the beginnings of a culture of literacy, information sharing, political opinion, and mass production, which would spread like wildfire throughout Europe and beyond. The newspaper contributed to mass political thought and provided the general public with access to information previously reserved for intellectuals and those of the upper class. As the geographic area that newspapers covered and the number produced both increased, a culture of literacy developed in which citizens expected to have access to information and the freedom to express their thoughts. Education became increasingly focused on literacy, and students could develop their own opinions based on information found in texts. This culture of literacy has evolved over the years, morphing to keep up with technology. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a major focus was on information literacy, where students learned how to search for books and articles, use a library, and evaluate written texts. More recently, with the digital revolution, we have discovered new forms of literacy, including digital literacy and media literacy, in which students use computers to find information, learn, and develop a wide variety of skills. Literacy now encompasses more than just reading and writing texts. It involves the entire realm of communication that is constantly evolving with technology. Education must continue to do what it has since before the creation of the newspaper and evolve, improving with and making use of the technology at hand. To remain relevant and current, the education system must embrace emerging forms of technology and teach the new forms of literacy.
Another important political and educational theme that developed along with the rise of the newspaper was the increasing shift in control of information from ruling elites to the general public. This would obviously impact the type of information published, the level of circulation, as well as the political and commercial impact publications could possess. As newspapers, printed materials, and literacy levels became more widespread, a greater number of individuals could openly share their ideas or read about the ideas of others that would not have been permitted by authorities in the past. This had dramatic effects on the levels of discourse and critical thinking that could take place in European society. It is not surprising that significant cultural and intellectual advances such as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Scientific Revolution accompany the developments in print and a greater freedom to share information. Today, unfettered access to digital forms of information could provide similar opportunities for major advances in cultural and intellectual pursuits. The educational community must take advantage of the opportunities to teach students how to locate, organize, analyze, and disseminate reliable information from the vast sources that are now at our fingertips. Educators have a historic opportunity to help engage learners in advancing our culture and the pursuit of knowledge. We only need to look at the rise of the newspaper to truly understand the power and potential that comes from a free exchange of ideas and information.